Good evening, I'm Dan Senor filling in for Charlie Rose. Last Thursday, Middlebury College experienced a scene that's becoming increasingly familiar. Dr. Charles Murray, a scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, was invited to speak. A massive protest greeted him. The intent was not to simply express peaceful dissent, but to shut down his speech. Dr. Murray and the Middlebury professor who interviewed him ran into a mob of protesters, several of whom physically assaulted Dr. Murray's interviewer and forced her to the hospital. The incident and others like it bring into sharp relief a growing tendency on American campuses, an intolerance for freedom of speech and a challenge to intellectual diversity. Joining me now to discuss this trend are Frank Bruni, an op-ed columnist for the New York Times. He writes frequently about higher education, and Frank is the author of a recent bestseller about the college admissions mania. Where You Go Is Not Who You'll Be is the title of the book. And Jonathan Haidt, who's a professor at NYU's Stern School of Business, is the author of the New York Times best-selling book, The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. He's also founder of a new organization dedicated to countering what he calls illiberalism on campus, called the Heterodox Academy. Welcome to you both. I want to start with you, Frank. There's a lot to cover in this discussion. First of all, how did we get here? This incident with Dr. Murray at Middlebury was not the first time this has happened. We're seeing this all over the place. This didn't exist when you and I were going to college.
No.
What has happened?
Well, luckily, we're not seeing the kind of violence at Middlebury or at UC Berkeley everywhere, but we are seeing this desire to shut down speakers who are unwanted. And I think there are three things that come to mind above all others. One is we are living in an era, when you step away from campus, of increasingly partisan, polarized, vitriolic debate. So why wouldn't we see a heightened version of that on campuses, among kids who are at the most passionate phase of life? I think it's also important to note that this is the generation that's the everybody gets a trophy generation, right? So no one modulates themselves or thinks I should kind of retire in the public space, let other people have their say, because everybody that's very individualist sentiment like that. And then lastly, and Jonathan I think can speak to this much better than I can, there's not a lot of ideological diversity on a lot of the campuses where this is happening. And so the notion that somebody with a perspective totally contrary to your own deserves the stage, deserves to be heard, that's sort of going away because there's so little diversity and there's so little appreciation for that, really important ethos of education and of civil debate.
What we're seeing in the last few years is the rise of a particular subgroup that is extremely passionate morally about equality, about fighting racism, and that's all great. But they've adopted a way that is kind of vindictive, that is all about calling people out. So people are afraid of them. And it's not just the students, it's actually the professors too. So even if it's only 5 or 10% on any campus, the fact that they can file charges against a professor.
Wow.
At NYU, we have a new bias response team. So any video I show, anything I say in class, if it offends a student, there's numbers all over in every bathroom urging them to call, report me. So that changes the way we teach. And then, as Frank said, if students aren't exposed to diverse ideas, then if somebody like Charles Murray comes, well, he spoke at Middlebury 10 years ago and there was no big problem.
After his more controversial book. He's since then, his 2012 book, Coming Apart, which is he was supposed to be much less controversial. That's what he was supposed to be speaking about.
It's quoted in opinion columns of the New York Times all the time.
Left and right.
That's right. And it's the biggest problem of our age. I mean, why did Trump win? It's the coming apart of by class.
It is a minority of students and it is a minority of schools. But they do set the tone. And at those schools where this is prevalent, it's really, really pronounced, and we're producing graduates who have little sense of the true ideological political diversity of American life. I went, within the last couple of years, want to be vague, to a very esteemed liberal arts college in the Northeast. And when I was there, the president had a dinner for me at the president's house, and all these faculty members went around the table and sang the praises of the school. And I heard about the affinity group they had for this group. I heard about XYZ. We got to the end, there were like 20 faculty members. At the end they said, do you have any questions? And they were all boasting about what a diverse environment they had. And I had one question. I said, is there a group for Republican students? And they looked at me like it had never occurred to them. And there was one student there, and she said, I think there is, but they maybe have one member. Now, schools trip over themselves to get racial diversity. They give a lot of lip service to socioeconomic diversity, and some of them do better than others. But what about this whole other kind of diversity? How are we going to move forward as a country if many of our top schools are graduating kids who have who can't even begin to process how a human being could vote for Donald Trump? They need to understand who voted for Donald Trump and why, and that they're not monsters.
I think the best analogy here is to understand what's happening with peanut allergies. Why are peanut allergies rising? They've been rising at an alarming rate since the 90s. And so what do? I take my kids to school. We get these long lectures on how we can't have any peanut butter in school.
And I go through the same. If you bring them, you're basically expelled.
Yeah, that's right. Look, a report came out last year. Do you know why peanut allergies are rising? Because we haven't exposed kids to peanuts. Right. That's the reason they're rising. So the new recommendation is you got to give kids peanuts early.
Right.
So this is what we've been doing in the name of. No, it's not even a metaphor. I mean, it's the exact same psychological process. So Nassim Taleb has this wonderful book called Anti-Fragile. Kids are anti-fragile. So if you're fragile, that means like, oh, if I knock this, it'll break. Don't knock it.
Right.
But anti-fragile, like your bones, your brain, your personality, you need challenges, you need setbacks. You need to experience exclusion and insult in order to make it to adulthood. And the biggest problem, I think, is the loss of unsupervised play. So Lenore Skenazy has been brilliant on this with her book Free Range Kids. You know, in our childhoods, after school, we spent time where there was no adult around, but there was a real crime wave.
No after-school programming. Yeah, imagine that. Right. You just have to come home and kind of figure out how to keep yourself busy.
Yeah. That's right. And so, but in the 80s, there was a real crime wave. There were anti-bullying measures. There was a fear of abduction. So for a variety of reasons, kids basically were never out of adult oversight. And now in many towns, you can get arrested if your kid goes to the park to play. Right. So, we can't be too tough on these kids. We have deprived them of experience, in the name of keeping them safe and happy and comfortable, we've deprived them of uncomfortable experiences with their peers. There's always an adult around. And so they come to campus. This is the last chance we could possibly give young Americans to learn to work out their differences. And we don't do it. We have more and more deans and processes and bias response teams so that there's always an adult to call in to settle the problem.
This is the, to use the jargon of today, this is the helicopter parent producing the bubble-wrapped kid.
Right.
And when I did my college book about admissions to elite schools and all that, the complaint I heard most often from deans of admission, from college presidents at the very top schools in terms of selectiveness, was that these kids arrive on campus and they are overachievers by every metric that college is using. And the phrase that sticks with me is one admissions dean said, "I am always amazed by the stunning fragility of these kids," which is exactly what Jonathan was talking about. And so what do? We give them these safe spaces. We construct these affinity groups. And debate about that is so shut down. I wrote a column not long ago asking the question, all of these colleges that put so much effort into bringing in a diverse class, once those kids are on campus, what do they do to actually promote interaction so that you have diverse interactions
Imagine that.
Right, and don't affinity groups, don't safe spaces, don't those sort of work in the opposite direction. I was forwarded tweets where people were saying things like, "I never knew Frank Bruni was such a racist." I was a racist because, so you asked how do Jonathan's colleagues react to him. When I talk to people in higher education, he's a hero because he's bringing up stuff about free speech and ideological diversity that they know needs to be but they won't say that in the public square, or they won't say the same things he's saying because they're so worried about a kind of shaming that the left right now, sadly, seems to specialize in.
Yeah, and I think this is really crucial. Mark Lilla had a piece in the New York Times right after the election on the problem of identity politics and how this may have alienated a lot of people and contributed to Trump's victory. And the response from many academics was ferocious. One of his colleagues at Columbia, within a few days, had some essay basically linking him to the Ku Klux Klan. Which is what happened. Yeah, that's right. But here's the point. So Lilla comes back with this brilliant point. He says, that's a slur, not an argument. And once he said that, I realized, oh my God, that is exactly what has been happening to me. I've been saying some pretty provocative things, beginning with an Atlantic article with Greg Lukianoff, and I keep looking on the internet for people who will respond to it, and pretty much nobody's arguing against me for anything I say. But I do get a lot of people basically saying, I'm a white male, or I somehow am winking at racism, something like that. So young people who go through these colleges, they're exposed to rhetorical training that prevents them from learning how to engage. They're trained carefully in how to basically discredit your opponent. Slur. Right. They learn to slur. They do not learn to argue.
So go look at the tape from Middlebury, and that's exactly what you see. You see students with their backs turned, and they're chanting slurs. They're not having an intellectual argument.
And then when I was on college campus, I was active in the Israel debate about the peace process. When I speak to students today on campus, they say the BDS movement, the boycott, divestment, and sanctions debate about boycotting Israel, getting campuses to boycott Israel, it's no longer just between those who support one policy on Israel and those who oppose another policy on Israel, which it was like when I was going to college. Now those who are hostile to Israel or U.S. policy towards Israel are joined by almost like a coalition of all these different factions who know nothing about the issue, but they all lock arms?
That's right. So, because the key to the new morality is a method of looking at society and looking in terms of power and privilege. So the old idea of an education is come to campus, we're going to teach you lots of perspectives that you can use, let's look at poverty. What would an economist say? What would a Marxist say? We used to learn a lot of perspectives to look at a single problem. What's happening now is some students, again, it's only in a few departments, but they're learning one perspective to look at everything. And so you start this. So there's a good kind of identity politics, which is, if black people are being denied rights, let's fight for their rights. That's the good kind. But there's a bad kind, which is to train students, to train young people to say, let's divide everybody up by their race and gender and other categories. We'll assign them moral merit based on their level of privilege is bad and victimhood is good. Okay, now let's look at everything through this lens. Israel, the Palestinians are the victims. So therefore, they are the good and the Jews, or the Israelis, are the bad. Right. So it's this one totalizing perspective. All social problems get reduced to this simple framework. I think we're doing them a disservice. I think we're actually making students less wise.
Right? Yeah, what I also see on campuses, Dan, is students who are not part of, who don't have the party line down pat. They really feel muffled. For some reason, frequently when I've been on campuses, I will have a student guide, or I'll end up with a student who gives some sort of tell that he or she is religious. And I'll say to that person, and I'm not a particularly religious person in the way we define it in this country, but I believe fervently in freedom along those lines. And I'll say to that student, how comfortable do you feel bringing up your religion or God in class, or in the fraternity house or the sorority house, whatever? And always this sort of, they're so happy I asked the question, they said, I almost never talk about it. That's so wrong. And you mentioned Israel. I think if you're an Israel supporter, you probably bite your tongue more than you do shout it out.
Right, keep your head down.
And you shouldn't have to do that.
That's right.
But before we leave, one thing I don't think we've said loudly and clearly enough is when people on the left, or whatever, however you want to, when they try to shut down this debate, do they not realize that Donald Trump's election in 2016 is partly the fruit of those sorts of actions? I know so many people who flirted with voting for Trump, who did vote for Trump, who were responding to his destruction of a kind of political correctness that they find oppressive. And so there's a real relevance to what we're talking about today on campus and who's governing our country right now. And I don't think the people on the left have wrestled adequately with that.
And the reason is because you have to see this not as a practical method of addressing problems. It's the dawn of a new religion. And I study moral psychology as though it's religion, politics, even sports tribalism. They're all manifestations of our tribalism. And I think we see this in the Charles Murray case very clearly. I just watched the video again today before coming here. And at the end, when the administrators say, okay, we're going to move the talk, and some of them scream, off campus, off campus. And then he says to another venue on campus, and they scream. Because what you have to see is the campus is there. It's a church. That's right. Wow. And you cannot have blasphemy on campus. And so the best way to understand what happened, I think, is an auto de fe. It's a religious rite coming together to punish the sinner, to punish the devil, and to reaffirm our community.